Okay, I'd like to ask some questions that are country-specific in terms of risks. And what do you see coming out of Russia and our relations with Russia? We obviously have problems with missile defense, NATO expansion, Georgia, energy. I mean, we could go on and on. We could do the whole interview.
North Pole.
Right.
All sorts of things.
But maybe could you reach for a couple of essential points on Russia? What do we need to know looking at '09?
Well, I guess the question is who's we? The United States has a lot of these problems. It's not clear to me if you ask the German government today, go talk to Merkel, do they have the same issues?
Right.
They're increasingly backing off of things like NATO enlargement and missile defense, and I think that's going to pose a challenge for the U.S. I suspect that what we'll see is that the Obama administration will back off a little bit. They'll try to tone down the missile defense rollout. They'll try to tone down the we need a membership action plan in NATO for Ukraine and Georgia right now with the hope that they can coordinate policy with the Europeans.
But you're talking about tone. Is it going to be more than tone? I mean, will there be substantive difference with the Obama administration?
Well, they'll back off a little. I think they'll back off a little in reality on pushing for Georgia must have a membership action plan now. That is a real change.
Right.
But I still think that the Russians fundamentally see security in their region, in the European region, in the Eurasian region, in zero-sum terms. And so America and NATO's gain is their loss. And I don't think you can suddenly just change that around in the course of a few months. I'm
just curious, do you think the Bush administration saw it that way? Zero sum?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think it depends on who you talk to in the Bush administration.
Good answer.
There were a lot of folks. I mean, there were a lot of people that were telling Georgian President Saakashvili, hey, back off, you poke a tiger, you poke a bear, they're going to whack you. And others saying, hey, we're with you, democracy, no matter what. Right. And Saakashvili listened to what he wanted to hear, and he ended up losing couple of pieces of his territory.
Right, but it would seem there are a lot of areas where the Russians and the Americans have common interest.
Where?
Well, I mean, there could be common interest in everything from North Korea to Iran.
You're assuming the Russians care, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the way the Russians have treated Iran is pay me. They were supporting the Iranians on Bushehr because they were making decent money out of it. They cut it off because the Iranians had almost paid the entire thing. Right. They were pretty much off the reservation. I mean, Condi Rice has this view, right? She said, look, if the Russians are going to support the U.S. on Iran, it's not because the U.S. is asking, it's because it's in their interest too.
Right.
Unfortunately, Russian foreign policy has tended to be informed by much more narrow definitions of self-interest, increasingly narrow, over the course of the last few years. And also it's been informed by growing both grassroots and top-down sense of anti-Americanism. And I think if you put those things together, it's going to be a tough nut to crack. The country that has the best relations with Russia right now in the G8 is Japan, which actually had the worst relations with Russia in the G8 sort of 10 years ago. And it's because Japan doesn't have foreign policy. Japan has industrial policy.
Right.
And so the Russians view the Japanese as a check-writing machine. And that works reasonably well.
Right.
But, to the extent that you start talking about security issues, you start having much greater problems with the Russians.
Great. Let's move to Iran. What do you see there in terms of, obviously, the nuclear program is the big issue, and then also regional instability?
Well, the nuclear issue is clearly moving, and they're not being slowed down. You talk to the folks in the IAEA, and they seem to believe that the Iranians will have nuclear capacity to develop a nuclear weapon, the first one, by the end of '09. Right. They also have elections coming up for their presidency in June 2009. Right. Oil prices have dropped precipitously. So you have an Iranian president that is seen to really get hurt on economic policy and does better on geopolitics. So if he wants to win, good time for him to provoke a conflict around this issue is in the run-up to the elections, just about when Netanyahu is likely to be the next prime minister of Israel. It's a very dangerous time for relations around Iran.
So is it the time for, the United States to be proactive or to be more hands-off in terms of letting some of these things run their course? Well,
they're clearly going to try to be proactive, and they're going to try to prevent the Iranians from developing their nuclear capacity and force more transparency, return of inspectors and the rest, and they'll try to engage the Iranians diplomatically. Thus far, that strategy, perhaps imperfectly applied, has not worked.
Right.
Do I believe that strategy is like to work in 2009? No. I think either the Israelis are going to strike, or more likely, the Iranians will go nuclear.
Is there much risk that the Israelis would split from the United States? In other words, do what they want to do without the permission or consent of the United States? Is that a risk?
I do not believe, if the Israelis decide that it is fundamentally in their national security interest to engage in strikes against the Iranians, I do not believe that their allies, the United States, will give them a red light. I think they'll give them a blinking yellow. And that's not a happy situation if you're Israel.
Right.
But it is a difference.
Right, I understand.
Yeah.
No, that's good. They're very helpful. Let's talk a little about Turkey. I mean, there's been a lot of concern about Turkey, actually, ever since my point of reference is the Clash of Civilizations, where if you read the book, the article in the book closely, I mean, Sam Huntington says that is the spot.
That's the nexus.
To be worried about. How does that look today, 2009?
That's right. Istanbul is actually apparently a city on two civilizations.
Right.
So what do? The European side, the Asian side. Well, it's very clear the EU has decided that they don't want Turkey in. I mean, they would talk about candidate membership status, but it's not happening, right? Which long term is bad for Turkey economically. It's bad for the EU economically. You know, this economic downturn in Europe really means that remittances back to Turkey are going to fall off a cliff. First-generation Turks are going to find they're increasingly not welcome in a lot of European states. Hard right nationalist sentiment against Turks and other Islamic minorities on the ground in these countries is growing. All of this is happening in a time where the Turks are fighting politically amongst themselves, the secularists versus the Islamists within Turkey. It's really not a good time to focus on the fight between who understands Turkish nationalism. What you want is focus on the Turkish economic crisis, and that's going to hurt these guys. You know, the political risk around Turkey going forward is much higher than you'd like it to be because their eye is on everything but the economic crisis.
And do we need to be concerned about fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, and the fomenting of it?
In Turkey?
Not necessarily from Turkey, but from the Islamic world, on that side of the civilizational divide.
You got to worry about places like Algeria, where increasingly al-Qaeda has a serious footprint and is growing and posing a domestic threat and international threat. Also places like Yemen, which have the capacity to become a failed state. And you know, you look at the pirates, aforementioned pirates. I mean, where are they getting fueled up? You know, Yemen's a big problem there. How much are they going to be able to actually hold it together going forward? Clearly, with a global economic downturn, you have to suspect that the demand for terrorism will grow, but also the willingness of disenfranchised local populations to support, or at least not turn in, potential local radicals is growing. And I think that that's going to be a structural danger that we're going to have to live with as the fallout of this, the necessary fallout of this economic crisis through 2009, 2010.